Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Let's get started, inshallah. We'll do the same format. We'll recap. We'll have an agenda today, and in that agenda, as part of that, we'll recap what we did last time and we'll look at reactive forms, or earlier they were called model driven forms. And we'll do some practice today. We'll try to find some time and continue practicing what we from where we left off last time. Let's go back and look at what we did last time. We looked at what is called route guard and what are the different types of route guards, and we looked at route resolver. Route guard is something that protects route. Why do we need that? It just depends on the architecture of the application or the requirements of the application. So the most popular route guard might be authentication route guard, where we let only authenticated users access to that route. But we do have ng if. We do have ng if directive, where we can just hide a link or show a link depending on the authorization, right? Then why do we need a route guard? The simplest answer is the route could be memorized by the user. It's just, the default scheme is pretty simple. It's just product/add, we get to add route. Even if the link is not present in our website, if one can guess, it that route is easily guessable. So route guards kind of protects the route from those kind of scenarios too. And a route resolver basically lets us resolve something before proceeding to the route. And until then, the route is not loaded, or that particular component at the route is not loaded. So that way we save ourselves from showing the user that particular route or the page where the data is not loaded yet. And if it results in some kind of delay over the network or over the data at the database, then we are not just showing the spinning, let's say, wait icon until we get the data and showing the blank page behind that. Instead, we show that the wait dialog, or we can show the wait icon from the page where the link is clicked itself. So route guard and route resolvers are the concept where I would say kind of intermediate level concepts in Angular, and very good to know, and very good to know from the interview point of view as well. So before proceeding to reactive forms, I just wanted to show a particular line over here. In the package.json, we have a section called scripts, and we see our most commonly used command over here, ngserve, to actually build the application and make it launchable, get it ready to be launched. Over here we see ngserve, but why do we need this command? Is like ngserve is Angular command, but these are telling npm or node package manager kind of shortcuts. I mean, in my opinion, they are not really shortcuts, but you can code anything, a long command over here, and use this as shortcut. Right now, they doesn't save us from any extra typing, but this is what it is. Let's say ngserve, I want to change the command. I mean, like other commands, ngserve also provides us options, and one of the options is changing the port. Right now, we are until now we were using just the default port 4200. So let's say if I run another application, last time we have seen that issue, right? If we run another application, then it will run on the same port package.json, because 4200 is the default port. So if we are working on multiple Angular applications, and we cannot run our application on the same port, all our applications on the same port. So if we have to change the port, then we can just code it like this. And instead of typing this particular longish command, we can just say npm start no package manager and start this command. So it has become a shortcut now. Now we can see it's launching ngserve. Should have shown us ngserve port 4300 over here. I just ran it yesterday in the same format and it was running fine. Let me just change it a little bit. Maybe it was, I ran it in WebStorm. I don't know if it makes any difference. Okay, it does. So WebStorm probably has a different interpretation. Anyway, it's throwing an error right now. Yeah, because there is no, there should have been a space over here, and probably Visual Studio Code doesn't display the entire command. Okay, now it is displaying. Earlier it was not. So in other case, I mean, this is just to change the port and run our application at a different port. So this is probably app 3. Because earlier I ran ngserve at the default port. Now I'm running at the new port. All right, let's quickly get back to our main topic for today, reactive forms, and we'll use reactive forms on our edit product. So this is the result of the route resolver. Once it is resolved, we can pass the data in the activated route. It exposes a property called snapshot, and within the snapshot has a property of data where we can use which we can use to retrieve our product. So this retrieved product was the name given in the route resolver. Yep, over here. So whatever name we give over here as part of the route for the resolved part of it, that's the name we use to retrieve that particular object from by name from the data property of the snapshot of the activated route. So let's actually build the reactive form while simultaneously comparing the template driven forms. So let me open the add product. Over here, open the edit product. So in template driven forms, we wrote everything or almost everything in the template. So what does add product have? Very simple. I mean, submit the form, initialization of the product, and this is for the deactivated route. If there are any unsafe changes, we build the logic over here in the component itself that we can provide it to the can deactivate guard, so that the can deactivate is not automatic and instead it depends on our logic. So if we look at the template, and we see a lot of code over here just for the three, or did we have four or three? Yeah, I believe it's three. One, two, three. Three input fields. And actually it depends. I mean, we kind of constrain ourselves to add just required and max length and min length for the product name. And this is a drop down. It doesn't have, I mean, unless it has a default option and that doesn't belong to any real option, then we add the required over here. And checkbox doesn't even need a required validator at all, or any other kind of validator. It's either checked or unchecked. It just have two states. But if the form is bigger, then we'll see a lot of code over here. A lot of code related to the form or submission of the form or the validation of the form. Anyway, the main driver of the template driven form is ng model. What does ng model do? Ng model writes, or we utilize ng model to a binding to write or read from a particular property on the in the component class, or on the property, like in this case of a component class. Product was our property, and then product itself has other properties, and we are binding to a name in this instance and a brand over here, and the property called fragile over here. So the main driver is ng model. Ng model is used for two-way binding, as well as ng model is used to define a template reference variable, which could be used in the template itself for other purposes, like displaying or reading the state of individual control or the form as a whole. Contrasting that to the reactive forms, the reactive forms are defined in the component class. Their validation is defined in the component class. So there are few ways, or at least a couple of ways, to actually define the reactive forms. The first thing what we need to do is import the reactive forms module. In our module file, module class, or the imports array of our module. Now that is imported. Basically, if we want to, let's copy the form from the add product itself and go from there. And we'll remove the template driven form specific stuff from over here. And what we need to remove, the first thing is the template reference variable on the form itself, and we'll have the submit form as is. Take off the ng model template reference, and we'll take off the ng model binding. Since we don't have any template reference variable called product name anymore, this doesn't make sense. We'll take this out. We'll have to bring it back in, but in a different way. and the validation will go off too. But it's a good idea to have. I mean, this is HTML validation. Maybe, I mean, it's a good idea to combine both the validations. The ng required, I don't know, maybe not. But we can take this off as well. So let's take it off for now. Name was a must with the template driven forms because our ng model kind of utilizes the name attribute of our input controls. Otherwise, it would throw an error. So now we can even take off the name too. Yeah, let's take off the name too and avoid some clutter. It wouldn't harm if we keep that. Let's take it off because I just decided to take it off. All right. So all we have over here, I mean, we don't even have a product form. It's plain HTML form, nothing Angular specific about it, except that ng submit, which we'll have to code anyway. So I did not clean it up. So somehow we need to submit the form. So Angular has something called a form control. Let's name it as name equals to new form control. So if we are using the form control approach, this is one of the approach. I just want to give a quick demo on it, and then we'll move on to a different approach that is most commonly used, and probably that makes sense overall. Form control will have to manage some of the things on our own. So that form control, what we use to bind it to our input control over here, or plain HTML input control over here, is via a binding called form control. Is our name control, or instead of just name, I'll just make it name control so that it's differentiated between the product name and the control. So we don't have the band property yet, that's what it's complaining about. And the submit the form doesn't exist, so we'll quickly define those two, or just copy it from here. Okay. We should, yeah, all the errors are gone. Let's get back to our reactive form business. We just instantiated it. We did not do anything with it. And what we can do extra with it, instead, apart from the instantiation, is we get some kind of clue from this little helper window. So it accepts an initial state, and it accepts any validation on that. So initial state, let me give it as an init, and validators is an array, and some of the built-in validators defined by Angular are provided via validators class, and it has some built-in or some static validators over here. So validators dot required validators dot minimum length. Length of 10. So a individual form controls could be defined this way, and even the other approaches are not very dissimilar from that, from this, except that with form controls we don't have a unified form group that we could assign it to the form and read the form's overall property. At least not that I know of. So this is good for individual controls. So if we have to look at it, we have the submit form, and let's try to quickly look at it in the browser. So this is edit one, so we are already here. Name is invalid. It's getting repeated twice. I don't know why. And it should have been valid in the first place. Anyway, we can see that init value is getting initiated over here, right? So we can provide default value, but that this default value should actually come from the product, right? So I'll take this off, init from over here, and then after getting the product or after getting the resolved product, I'll initialize it. This form control is already instantiated. We don't have to instantiate and provide the validators all over again. We can utilize a property called set value. Or I mean, as you can see, we can even set validators later on. We don't have to instantiate with the validators. But because we'll not change the validators all along, we'll just we don't have to do the set validators. All we have to do is set value over here, and let's set value from the property of the product, which is name in this case. So, was there no name? Okay, these are coming. Product name is invalid is coming because we did not attach any condition to it. So it just text right now, and this should have been brand and not name. Most likely I forgot after pasting it. So we'll ignore those two warnings for now and try to troubleshoot why we are not getting the product name initialized. So let me just console.log. This is the product. Name of undefined. So somehow we are not getting the data out of here. Product resolver, get product. So anyway, just a quick point you might have noticed from get product resolver. Get product actually returns an observable of product, but while we are consuming that product, we are not doing a subscribe or anything like that, because resolver takes care of that. It uh, gets the data and subscribe it and resolves the subscribed value and returns that back. So we don't have to worry about that. Just a quick point. Let's get back to debugging this. Log ID. Let's quickly learn something about this backticks notation. So let's say before going over there, let's say I want to write something like the ID is and log the actual ID. So this is one of the way to do it, and this is kind of what you say old way to do to log something when we have to append some values, or let's say insert some values in between. Change this a little bit to constant product or just PR, and then return PR so that I can log a method before log some more information before returning that PR. So return PR, and let's say I want to write something like this. The ID is ID plus full stop. The product is plus PR, right? In TypeScript, in JavaScript, the latest version of JavaScript and many other languages, they provide in-place substitution kind of thing, which makes the developer's life easy in logging something or composing strings. So let's try to use that notation. Backticks. Backticks is right before the key 1, to the left of key 1. So we use backticks, and backticks supports a notation called, we can enclose some variable value right in the string, right in a string placeholder, and that placeholder is encapsulated within the flower braces. So something like this. The ID is and it's prefixed by a dollar. So as soon as you I put the dollar in there, it turned blue instead of blue from brown, right? So now within those flower braces, I can just insert the ID and then keep on tapping. The product is, yeah. So I don't have to keep track of plus and where to add the where to concatenate the strings and all that stuff. So this is a little bit easier. So let's troubleshoot using this. Okay. ID is one, the product with object. It should have been an actual product. So let's we have seen earlier, we can just write the debugger statement and make the browser stop right here. We don't have to console log all the time. So this is a little different trick to debug. Okay, this dot products dot length is 0. Okay, I see the issue. I think we have to traverse back from get products, because get products is actually checking if there are any products. If there are any, it returns that. Otherwise, it returns it adds couple of them to the list and then returns. So let's do that. We should have some products now, couple of them. Oops. So something else is wrong over here. So I'll troubleshoot it later on. For the time being, let me just make a little change so that we are not blocked in what we are trying to learn today. So instead of checking for this, before checking for this products, what I will do is just make a call to get products. So what it will do is it will check if there are no products, then it adds couple of them. So let me just use this shortcut. I need to do probably subscribe. I'll fix it and then we'll discuss that. We'll discuss what was going wrong in our next session, inshallah. So now we have laptop coming back in. And if we go to the products and then go for the Dell one. Oops. Supposed to be two. Still going for Lenovo. Oh, we did not. We just copied pasted, but we did not bind anything. So anyway, we change the name, one of the names, or maybe both of them. Laptop one and laptop two. Okay, laptop two. Now we can see how it is bound. So now that is about single control, and let's move on to how to handle a group of controls. This logging is good to have. Let's have it. Some point of time we can come back and remove it, but it doesn't hurt anything. We know the ID, or that's what we are just logging to the console so that we can troubleshoot. So let's have it over there and not take off, not bother about taking that off. And let's come back to another way of writing reactive forms. So another way is there is something called form group. So let me write that as form control, and so form group, like the helper window says over here, it needs a definition of the controls, and that would be a key value pair, and those controls should be of type abstract control. But actually, even the form control is of type abstract control. Oh, sorry, yeah. Let me go to the definition and show it over there. Yeah. Form control extends abstract control. So all these controls and control groups are of type abstract controls. So, and this form group accepts a bunch of properties or a bunch of controls where we can define again one name. Let's say name one control, just to have a different name, and provide the initial value and all the stuff over here. So probably this will be new form control. Yeah. So anyway, the point over here is, and probably we'll try if we have enough time with this approach too, but we'll utilize inbuilt form builder control for our purposes, which provides automatic grouping of forms, which provides a method where we can group the forms, where we can group the form controls or related form controls, and that has the ability, that gives us the same ability as explicitly creating a new form group. So let's use that approach. Controls should be something like this. So now we have defined a name one control for this particular form group and just consuming the existing name control. So similarly, we can do a brand control and then give the initial value and whatever validation needs to be given, or the validation rules needs to be given, and then have one more control over here called brand control, the brand control that we will define. So anyway, so this is maybe an first approach itself, because this just the individual controls are not very useful, because they are useful on an individual control but not on a form level. Form level will have to do something else on our own. So I'll take off the name control too and use or inject in our constructor something called a form builder. So what this form builder helps us with is this dot form builder dot group, create a group or a control or an array. So we are after the group right now so that we can target the form directly, and that group accepts something called a controls config. That controls config is a name value pair again of the controls that we need. So let's go for name control, which would be an object accepting initial value. Let me just have that written over here explicitly, and it accepts should be an array. Okay, give me a minute. I don't know, this is how it should be. Name control is not assignable of type parameter, or then what does it say now? Cannot find name control. Okay, actually. Okay. Somehow I keep going wrong with this again and again, even though I referred to it yesterday itself. Did a little bit of practice, but let me check it out. What is going on? Give me a couple of minutes over here. Okay. So it accepts. Okay. So extra. Okay. Okay. So it accepts an object and of key value pairs, and each key, I can even remove this now. Okay. This is the key of the control and these are the values. So I just gave it an initial value, and for validators we'll have to define in an array because validators might be more than one. Validators dot required, validators dot min length 10, and validators dot max length of min was 3 and max was supposed to be 10. Now that we are done with comparing the template driven, probably I'll close and probably reopen if needed so that we have more visibility over here. Okay. So for it, for more controls, we just give comma and if how many ever number of controls we need. Control and again the initial value. Actually, that's initial value is not just a string, but actually this is an initial state, not just a value. So by that, what I mean is, even though it's not explicitly defined over here, controls config. Okay. What I mean by initial state is just state is not just a value, but let's say let's see it as an example. So value, give the initial value of for that particular control, and let's say we want to disable it, or I mean provide the value for the attribute disabled from over here itself. So that if we give it as true, so this is basically state of the entire control, not just a value property. Right? So when will this help? Let's say, I mean, the user, if we have user authorization or user roles on each field, then we can make a decision over here whether this particular user that is trying to edit this product is uh, authorized to actually make a change to that particular field, in this case name. So it's not just an initial value, this is entire state of that control that we want to actually control. So it's a good habit to initially start writing in this manner rather than just giving it a string as initial value, so that it gets imbibed in our brain as to the capability of this particular individual control. So anyway, let's go for the brand, and brand, whatever the initial value. Actually, because we already have a product, if this was a form for the ad product, then we would give the empty values or some default values. But in this case, the initial value will not make sense. So we'll go ahead and change this to this dot product dot name, and initial value over here it will be this dot product dot brand. And we are not disabling, but let's just see it in action for the name. Disabled, false. We'll come back and make it false over here as well. And the validators that we need is just the required thing. And what other two controls do we have? Name, brand, and reference fragile. Comma. So over here we defined, I mean, with the new approach, what we need to do is, earlier we had form control as the name of the control, but we don't have that anymore. We took it off and we are utilizing the form group, and we are utilizing the form builders service to create that group. So basically what this returns is a group or a form group. So let's define that form group. This dot product form group, and assign whatever is returned from that dot group of the form builder to our form group. Declare properties. So we have form group, and this form group we assign to the forms property called form group. This should be a binding. Okay. And then instead of form control, we go for form control name. And the name of the control that we have given over here, which is name control, which we are just fine with. we can see because we gave it as disabled, that's why it's disabled over here. We can just have it. I mean, because we have explicitly written the code over here, it's kind of obvious that, okay, this is what controls it. If you were just using the shorthand for the initial value, then probably we would be confused. So that's why I'll go ahead and make it false. Okay, let's see how we can control, or let's try to write some states, just as we have done earlier with when we were writing the template driven forms, and see if we get something over here. Yep, we got something. Let's see the varied property of that. So basically, because this is again deriving from the abstract control, which is of the type form control, they have the definitions of like all the properties that we have seen earlier, or the state of the form, if it is valid or invalid, pristine or touched or untouched, and pristine versus dirty. So all the same thing that we can the same thing that we could utilize just as we did on the template driven form. So those things are common with both the approaches. So we'll just do the same thing of disabling the submit button until everything is valid. So let's take care of that first, and for that purpose let's open the add product so that we can easily and quickly copy it from here. So that's what we did. If it is invalid, okay, so that was not hard. So instead of, we have different name for the product for the form now. It's just not product form, it's product form group, just to signify that we are utilizing the form group. So disabled if the form group is invalid. Let's inspect a property on the form control for errors. Should have it one. Anyway, let's use this on errors. Undefined. Probably it needs a definition somehow. So basically, let me, we are getting some error when we, let's say, have an invalid input on the name control, and that property could be utilized to show the actual error, just like we did over here. The product name is invalid. So basically we can improve on this and show to the user the exact error. I mean, right now it just says invalid, and the user would not know what is invalid, right? So that kind of validation messages could be provided in a custom way via these validators properties. So each of these validators will provide a message, custom message, and that custom message is populated in the errors property. And we'll see how to target this errors property and display a particular or targeted message or a specific message on the type of error that the user is seeing in our next session, inshallah. So we'll go back to our practice session and try to spend some time over there, and then meanwhile I'll just check it in. So just to recap, reactive forms, because we are writing everything in the component class itself, you might have guessed that it's easy to test, easy to configure for our testing purposes, because it doesn't involve the HTML. Testing HTML is very a little difficult. These are pretty simple forms, but if the forms grows a little complex, we'll have to, and then there might be a logic of what do you say, if the user checks or selects something else, a different input control should appear or should not appear or should hide or should change its values. So those kind of things are pretty hard to extract from the HTML for testing purposes as well as mocking purposes, because the control with the reactive forms lies in the actual class. This class could be instantiated for our testing purposes easily, and these properties could be passed. And because we are using dependency injection for these dependencies, we can easily inject mockable dependencies. I mean, the fake dependencies for testing purposes. We don't have to inject real dependencies. Well, by that, what I mean is, let's say, I mean, we have a product service dependency over here, which actually adds or edit product, and it goes to the database, and it actually saves that edited product. But for the testing purposes, we don't have to. I mean, unless we are just testing that specific part of whether the database is getting updated, that's when we need to actually go to the database and see and test that part. But otherwise, if you are just testing the UI, if you are just testing that functionality of the UI and the flow of the UI, then we don't have to go to the database where we can mock up these dependencies. So for that purposes, reactive forms are better suited. But for simple forms, I mean, that's what the Angular documentation says, use template driven forms for simple forms. And because these are versatile, these are comprehensive, it's better to have much more practice on reactive forms rather than template driven forms. So we'll come back and uh, take care of the validation part on the template on the reactive forms and how to give the user a specific message, and probably try to do the same with respect to template driven forms too. And that is possible over there. Whatever is possible with reactive forms, most likely, I cannot guarantee that, but it is possible with the template driven forms as well. But it will be much more complex. We'll have to write a lot of logic in the HTML using those probably ngIf directives to hide or show something depending on the context. But it's very easy to control, to write that code uh, in a programming language than in a markup language. So that's the biggest advantage that the reactive forms have over template driven forms. So at last time I believe we wrote this form, and we we need to probably tie the logic to actually saving the task. Task list. So right now we just have task list works, and we have a service for that. Task service here, and we did not integrate with the task service at all. So all we have is a form. Let me just stop the other. I didn't have to stop because I was going at put 4300, but anyway we are not doing anything with that, so it will not hurt to stop that. We just serve or use the shortcut npm start. We need a submit button over here. Input type, submit value, submit. This is required. Probably everything is required over here. Then it's just a checkbox. It doesn't make sense to have a required validation over here, and then we need a min length and max length. It just depends on, yeah, min length and max length might be compulsory for text fields because we might have defined fields in the database to have certain length or certain max length and no minimum length. But if something is uniquely used to uniquely identify, then probably we'll need that. Or even if not uniquely identify, but I mean, a name is used to identify something, right? We cannot go for the ID all the time. ID might not make sense for the end user at least. So we'll need to have some entry over there instead of just an empty string. So minimum length could be enforced for that purposes. Or we can even have minimum length of, let's say, just one, and max length of, it depends on our design, but let's say 100 should be good enough. Task. So I did not cover this with app1, or I did not write it that way, but another way to write or to submit the form is submit instead of having an empty submit and that submit looking at the task and just passing on the task to the product to the task service to get it added. Instead of that, we can even pass the form itself, and then that submit method might, oops, we don't have a submit over here, but still it's not complaining somehow. So I'll define a submit method and look at this task form. If it is valid, then proceed, otherwise don't. If task form not valid, it is not. Okay, we need to inject task service over here. So we need to write those methods too. And this, we submit the task that was filled. So now this is an additional check. Over here we are not, will, I mean, with the, did not write that code yet, but our disable logic should keep the button disabled until the form is valid. Disabled if the form is invalid, right? So this is an additional check. Even if somehow the user is able to submit the form, we additionally check one more time over here. If it is valid, then we go ahead and add the task, or else we can return a message, or we can just ignore. So let's have a message over here. This dot message over invalid form. So basically I'm redoing the same stuff, but except in a different context. Instead of product, this is a task. I mean, overall it shouldn't matter because it's just a different shape, it's just a different name, but the properties might be either string or a boolean or another object. Like in the product case, it was a brand, and we select from one of the existing brands. So things like that. So the shape might be a little different, but overall we are just redoing the same stuff. Message string, and then that message could be displayed somewhere after the form, or we don't even have to display as a part of the page. We can just have it as a pop-up or some kind of a toast message on the top that disappears after a while. So it just depends on our choice of design. So add task, we don't have a method, so we'll just use the Visual Studio helper to actually create a method instead of us writing that method. So it creates a skeleton for us. We'll just have we'll maintain the list of products just like we did earlier. Instead of going to the API list of tasks, instead of using an API. But if we were using an API, then it would just save it in the database. So we'll just kind of mimic over here the behavior. So what text? We wrote a form, we tied it to the service, we are submitting it. Somehow, I mean, it's not recognizing the type so of the form. That's why it's showing me a little helper message to actually strongly type it rather than leave it like that. What we can probably do is just type it to form control of the type form control. For that, we'll have to make sure that we have imported the forms module. We haven't run this yet, so that's why maybe we did not see any errors with respect to this module not being present. Yeah, sometimes the IntelliSense doesn't work, so in that case we'll have to type it, or maybe if we restart, sometimes the typing will help grasp where certain things are or how certain things are laid out. So some once in a while it's a good idea to just to not utilize IntelliSense. And now I had the opportunity, I went ahead and then typed it myself. Anyway, where we form control. So now that we have imported that module, IntelliSense is working, but it wasn't working in that file for some reason. So that will have a valid property among others. So let's have a look at what else it has. It has a constructor, it has a set value, it has a patch value, reset, register on change. So then the patch value is basically refers to adding or as setting a value on a form group level. So that's how you submit, and edit would be similar except that we pre-populate the particular tasks properties in those controls, whereas for add they will be blank. Or it depends on the scenario. I mean, if we want to have a default brand on each of the product like in our other application, then we can initialize the default brand in our form. So but mostly it will be a brand new, and that means blank name, blank brand, blank fragile. It's one of those I mean, in a way it's a default value, so we cannot have, or probably, I mean, it depends on our application need. If the default value is true, then it will be true, then we can still initialize it, but at least mostly that can be called as a blank itself. So what else can we do in, let's say, 5 minutes and stop there? Yep, let me refer to something on our agenda and get a clue if we can do something within the little time that we have. Okay. Probably we can just create a guard and get a little bit of practice on that. And that was pretty simple. Anyway, we utilize Angular CLI, ng generate guard, and we name that particular guard. And if it is specific, if it is generic enough to be generated across the application, we just use a shared folder, because that's supposed to be shared across the application, or just not use the shared folder at all. It's up to us. Guard will get appended automatically, so I don't have to explicitly do it. We can use a dry flag or dry run flag and see what we get is what we are expecting. It's asking me what kind of guard do I want to create. We looked at can activate and can deactivate. Can load is on the module level. Whenever we are if we lazy load it, because if you don't lazy load it, it will load anyway. If you lazy load it and the user is trying to go to a particular route which is in a lazy loaded module, then instead of loading the module and deciding a particular route is mapped to a component, right? Eventually, so instead of deciding after loading the entire module, what we could do is we can use the can load route guard and stop the user route right there even before the module is downloaded, thereby saving the bandwidth. All right. And can activate child is again for a lazy loaded module. There might be a child where child route which we want to protect, we can protect it right there using can activate child. So that's about the other two route guard that we haven't looked at in detail. So can activate and can deactivate it. Can deactivate, we looked at it using examples. So in this case, let's have a can activate route guard just for practice purposes. So no, the dry run flag means no changes were actually made. So let us run without dry run flag. So that's about how to generate that and the logic pertaining to the guard. In this case, because we named it as authentication guard, so that means we look if the user is authenticated, did the user log in? If not, then we can even route the user to the login page. So let's say we check the logic for the login, check if the user is logged in. If logged in, I'll just write it as true to avoid some errors. If the user is logged in, return true. If not, let's quickly look at this. Let's inject something called a router. So using the router, we can navigate or we can route the user to the login page. So let's say our login route is /login. Instead of true, I just write something else just to avoid that warning that this code is unreachable and because it was grayed out. Anyway, this is we have seen how to route the user by providing a link, right? Over here, nav bar over here, and then using the router link. Basically, the router link points to a route, or this is declaratively in the template. How to do it in the component using the router or using the router service that could be injected in the constructor, and then we just navigate the user to that particular page. So if the user is logged in, good, return true, let the user in. If not, ask the user to log in by providing them the form. So while we are at this concept of writing code to navigate the user programmatically using the component class, let's also discuss a little detail of how to add parameters to this. Let's say, I mean, this is a auth guard, and there should not be any logic other than the authentication, the user authenticating the user and forwarding the user accordingly. But let's say in another scenario, if we have to forward the user to an edit products page, so this will be something like products edit, and we need to pass some data, and if it is dependent programmatically on something else, we can just pass that id over here via variable. Let me just write where product id equals to 3. So we can pass data to the route like this. And how did we pass it earlier in a different scenario using declarative syntax is on the products component app product was taking care of that. So let's have a look at that component or the template in the component. So it was dynamically generated similar way, but product slash edit, and then we are binding to the ID property of the product. So how to do it programmatically is like this. So another scenario is where after successfully adding the product, we if we want to route the user to the product listing page. Submit the form, we can easily do instead of the message, or we can still send a message to the parent component and also route the user using the router or injecting the router in the constructor and then route the user. Let me just write the code over here because we already have the router. So something like this, products, or if you want to send a message, something like that, and we can pass a message object saying okay, display this message. So let's stop over here. We don't have a login page, but let's leave the code. This code will work because one is equals to 1, so this is all the time true, and this will return true. It will never enter else, and because we don't have a route called login, it will never error because it will not hit. But if it hits, then we'll have an error from Angular saying that this route doesn't exist. All right, let's stop here, inshallah, and let's regroup next week and proceed further, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.